Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of the 2019 Erasmus Lectures on the History and Civilization of the Netherlands and Flanders. This is the first of 3 lectures. The second and the third one will be exactly 1 and 2 weeks from now. My name is Frans Papen. I chair the committee that nominates the lecturer. And the lectureship is quite unusual, actually. It's unique in its kind at Harvard. It was established in 1967 by donations from a number of private parties, either in the Netherlands or expatriates. And it was supplemented in 1994, the endowment, by a donation from the government of Flanders. So it covers the entire Dutch-speaking region in Europe. And of interest is everything that goes on concerning the history and civilization of that region, and we invite internationally people who can talk about many aspects thereof. And so over the years we've had 45 of those lecturers, and it won't surprise you given the title that the plurality of those are historians. There have been 12 historians, there have been 7 in language and literature. There have been 5 in music. There have been people in history of science, in sociology. We've even had people in economics, and even the law school occasionally has hosted some people. And we've had 5 art historians. And again, that large number is not so surprising either, given the strong history of art in that part of Europe. And today's speaker is eminent representative therein. It's Erik Jan Sluiter from the University of Amsterdam. And I'm calling now on Martha Deschi, the director of the Harvard Art Museums, to introduce him. Martha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard Art Museums. It's just wonderful to see such a big turnout for Dutch art. You know, we're always told that Boston is a Dutch art town, and it sure is. You're voting with your feet. So thanks for being with us. And thank you, Professor Spapen, for your remarks on the Erasmus Lectureship, and for all that you and your committee have done to ensure the success of this important program over the years. In collaboration with my colleagues in the Department of History of Art and Architecture, I welcome you all to the first lecture in a series entitled Art and Competition in the Dutch Golden Age. I hope you will also join us for the second and third lectures in the series, which will take place here next Friday, March 1st, and the following Friday, March 8th, both at 4 p.m. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished lecturer, Erik Jan Sluiter, Professor Emeritus of Art History of the Renaissance and Early Modern Period at the University of Amsterdam, an eminent scholar of Dutch art and a dedicated teacher and supervisor. He is a deeply admired mentor and model for countless individuals in the field. Professor Sluiter earned his PhD from Leiden University and began his career as a research fellow at the RKD in The Hague, the foremost center for art historical research in the Netherlands. He was appointed to the faculty of Leiden University in 1976 and taught there until 2002, when he assumed his position at the University of Amsterdam. He also held appointments as visiting professor at Yale University in 1991 and at the University of Rome Sapienza in 1993. And from 2002 to 2007, he divided his time between Amsterdam and New York, spending 1 semester each year as a visiting professor at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. Presently, he serves as chair of the Amsterdam Center for the Study of the Dutch Golden Age, which, through a variety of initiatives, examines the art, culture, and history of the Dutch Republic in an international and interdisciplinary context, exploring the impact of this remarkable early modern nation on the economy, politics, and culture of Europe and the world. Our speaker has published widely on the art of the Netherlands from the 16th to the 18th century. In addition to the numerous articles and essays, he has contributed to scholarly journals and catalogs. he has authored major volumes on mythological painting in the Dutch Golden Age, the so-called Leiden fine painters, Rembrandt and his circle, and many other topics. In 2000, for example, he published Seductress of Sight, a fascinating look at 17th century rhetoric on the look at 17th century rhetoric on the illusionistic, sensuous, and deceptive qualities of painting and the way artists thematize these ideas in their work. This was followed in 2006 by Rembrandt and the Female Nude, an in-depth analysis of this artist's ambitious engagement with the subject and topos of the nude throughout his career. Our speaker's most recent book is Rembrandt's Rivals, History Painting in Amsterdam, 1630 to 1650, which appeared in 2016 and is to be followed by a second volume dedicated to the latter half of the 17th century. Focusing on Rembrandt and the artists working in his orbit, this monumental study of the market for history painting in Amsterdam raises important questions about the value, both monetary and cultural, that societies place on art and its makers. It is this publication that forms the foundation of the current series of lectures and the course that Professor Sloter is currently teaching at Harvard entitled Making Art in Amsterdam, circa 1645 to 1675, Rembrandt and his competitors, a perfect topic in this year of Rembrandt. My colleagues and I are thrilled to have this distinguished scholar with us here at Harvard, along with his wife, Dr. Nicolette Slaughter-Seifert, also an expert in Dutch art, who is with us tonight. It's an auspicious moment for Dutch in Boston, as I think you know, specifically here at the Harvard Art Museums, as we were the recent recipients of major gifts of Dutch art, drawings from the Maida and George Abrams collection, and from the collection, paintings from the collection of Anne and Peter Brook. We are deeply grateful to these donors for their exceptional generosity, as well as to the Stanley H. Durwood Foundation for its support of all of our Dutch art initiatives here at Harvard. I would again like to express my deepest thanks to the Erasmus Lectureship Committee and to the Department of the History of Art and Architecture. Here at the museums, my thanks go to the Department of Academic and Public Programs, and our former drawings curator, Edward Kopp, who has since departed for the Menil in Houston, but who was formative in helping us bring about this particular iteration of the Erasmus Lectureship. So now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Erik Jan Sloter.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great honor to stand here as this year's Erasmus lecturer and to present this first lecture of a series of 3 organized by the Harvard Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Harvard Art Museums. I'm truly grateful to have been invited for the Erasmus Lectureship on the history of civilization and of the Netherlands and Flanders at Harvard University. And I feel it also as a great honor to be able to teach at this university on that part of the Netherlandish cultural heritage for which the Netherlands and Flanders are undoubtedly most renowned. That is the art of painting, drawing, and printmaking. For 1.5 centuries, Netherlandish paintings, drawings, and prints have been collected in the United States with great eagerness and zeal. So that they are extremely well represented in museums, small and large museums all over this country. Also, the study of Dutch art used to be a very rich and lively field in the United States. But over the last 2 decades, quite a few American specialists in Dutch and Flemish art have retired and have not been replaced. And quite a few will retire soon, which means less students, less PhDs, less expertise, not only at universities, but also in museums. But in contrast, the Boston area might have a great future in this regard, and you heard already something about this. Now that the Harvard Art Museums received so many Dutch and Flemish drawings from the fabulous collection of Maida and George Abrams, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts large numbers of Dutch and Flemish paintings of the highest quality from the collection of Rosemary and Eik van Otterlo and Susan and Matthew Weatherby. While at the MFA, through the support of the Otterlos and the Weatherbys, even a Center for Netherlandish Art is in the making. Reason enough to be very optimistic, and to turn now to the still topical subject of my lecture, art and money. But then, in Amsterdam's golden age. The title of this lecture, and I have to put that on. Yes, there it is. Okay. The title of this lecture is a quotation, as you may have guessed. Here is the stock exchange and the money and the love of art. Now, you might think that I'm quoting a successful New York banker who bought works by Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst during the booming 1990s, but this is, on the contrary, the last line of a poem written in 1653. Hier is de beurs en het geld en liefde tot de kunst. This verse concludes the poem's argument that the art in Amsterdam far surpasses both that of the ancient Rome and modern Rome. These lines were recited at a festive occasion where painters, poets, and art lovers were assembled. It emphasized the pride in the Amsterdam Exchange as the nerve center of commerce in the 17th century Europe. And for those present, it would have stated the obvious. Here was the greatest wealth, as exemplified by its new town hall, the largest public building of that time in Europe, which was at that moment being built. And as a self-evident corollary, here was the thriving community of artists and art lovers. As in this poem, this beautiful map of 1625 also proclaims the notion of Amsterdam surpassing Rome and antiquity. This map is dedicated to the consuls, praetors, scabini, and senatores of the Republica Amstelrhodensis. We notice the city's 2 patrons, Mercury and Neptune. Mercury representing not only commerce, with an Norman talent purse in his hand and sitting next to bales of merchandise, but he functions simultaneously as the patron of the arts. Apart from piles of books next to him, we find a palette with brushes in the festoons. Finally, we notice beneath the gorgeous city profile the name of Venus Anadyomene, or Venus Rising from the Sea, the legendary painting of the most celebrated painter of antiquity, Apelles. And then we discover also the name of Apelles himself in the Latin poem underneath. This poem tells us that Apelles, risen from the dead, wandered around the world lamenting his lost paintings, in particular his renowned Venus Anadyomene. Hoping that he will be able to paint her again, but even more beautiful than before, he finally sees the city of Amsterdam. And then he exclaims, "This is Venus risen from the sea, worthy of my endeavors. This is her, not just honored in Greece, but admired by the whole world." Thus, this flourishing beauty, Amsterdam herself, epitomizes the extraordinarily beautiful Venus of Apelles and surpasses the one from antiquity, thus embodying everything of which the art is capable of. And at the same time, it's the city where the reborn Apelles finally feels at home. But who would become the new Apelles of Amsterdam? And how do you become that? And how is the position of this, would this position of this new appellant be in the art market related to that of painters slaving away at the lower end of the same art market? When discussing this, I will restrict myself to history painting, considered the field of the most ambitious painters. It was also an Amsterdam specialty, and I will focus on Rembrandt in the first place. But as contrast, I will also turn to a few minor masters. And at this point, I would like to say that in my research on Amsterdam history painting, that is mainly biblical painting and classical mythology, and of the position of history painting in the Amsterdam art market, over the years I've greatly profited from the work of students. Mainly master students who have accomplished excellent works in papers for seminars in the master theses, as well as of PhD students under my supervision. I'm proud of this and gratefully integrated their findings, as you can see in particular in my book. It was already mentioned, the last book, Rembrandt's Rivals, History Painting in Amsterdam, 1630-1650. The pride in the staggering growth of the city and its economy was immense. Also, foreigners visiting the city emphasized this time and again, with amazement. And Grand Duke Cosimo III, as he put it, for example, more trade is conducted in Amsterdam than in any city of the world. Foreigners stand perplexed when they see this for the first time. It seems as if all the four quarters of the compass have robbed themselves only to enrich this city and to bring the rarest and most amazing treasures into her harbor. And with the economy, the market, its art market had in a few decades expanded from a rather insignificant art center to one of the most thriving of Europe. And the number of artists has grown, as you see here, with breathtaking speed. Attracted by the opportunities in Amsterdam, painters came from all over the Netherlands and surrounding countries to settle in Amsterdam. The area of recruitment was astoundingly wide. Today, we would say that a true clustering of a thriving creative industry took place. Such a clustering had many advantages, of which I listed here a few, which I will not discuss now, just show it here, but such clustering was crucial for the competition and innovation, and thus for the raising the general quality. All young painters had to secure a place for themselves in this rapidly growing, constantly changing art market. It was a market that knew no moment of stability, as you see here. Nobody knew where the ceiling would be, which was reached obviously in the early 1660s, after which the number of painters and thus the production of paintings would decline even faster than it had grown. As of the 1670s, the economy was stagnating. But already in 1660, overproduction combined with changing fashions for decorating the houses began to affect the market for painting severely. But in 1631, the year that Rembrandt began to work for Amsterdam clients, and also the time that the number of painters and no less the number of history painters, which you see to the right, that's the moment that begins 1630s, that it rises steeply. And at that time, everybody must have been very optimistic about the prospects of the profession. Many talented young men started their careers in the 1630s. As of the moment Rembrandt worked in Amsterdam, and he settled there permanently in 1633, he would have been the favorite candidate for the new appellees. He would have considered himself the best history painter and portrait painter, and doing everything to make sure that others would think so as well. Towards the end of his life, Rembrandt's friend, the poet Jeremias de Dekker, praised him profusely in a laudatory poem as the apelles of his time, stating that even in Rome, thousands strike the flag, where one is free to marvel at his strokes, and those of Raphael and Angelo compare, and see, he has indeed surpassed them both. Here, competition with the greatest in art history, and again with Rome, resounds forcefully. Of course, Rembrandt was certainly not the only one to be called the new Apelles. But I refer to this poem to show how matter-of-course such thoughts about competition with the greatest in the art would have been. And that a painter like Rembrandt, as well as his admirers, were very much aware of this. Certainly, these are rhetorical commonplaces. But this means precisely that such notions were in everyone's head and would determine the painter's aspirations and the art lover's expectations. But only for a few painters at the top such aspirations would have meant something. There must have been a great distance in ideas and practices between those at the top and those at the lower end of the art market. About a decade after Rembrandt's entry in Amsterdam, the art scene had changed spectacularly, boosted by a number of young talents who had come from elsewhere. Apart from Rembrandt, there were... Apart from Rembrandt, there were, in the field of history painting, for example, Jacob Bakker and Govert Flinck, for a short time Joachim von Sandrart, and the young Ferdinand Bol. And the Amsterdammers Gerbrand van de Eekhout and Jan Victors would also step in around 1640, while Jan Lievens and Jacob van Loo came in the course of the 1640s. Now we are confronted with a production at the top, with Rembrandt in the lead, where the level of the prices at the top had become of a different order than before. To obtain insight into the factors that affected the growing divergence in prices, we should first realize that the character of the market for painting had changed radically in the past decades. Not only had the production expanded enormously in volume, and it was still growing rapidly, but paintings had become a consumer goods. Commodities with which burghers literally crammed the walls of their houses. Visiting foreigners were always astounded when they saw this. These paintings were for sale in every price category, a development that had started in Antwerp in the 16th century, but more than in Antwerp before, a bewildering variety of types, subjects, sizes, styles, and techniques had developed, while the methods of marketing could also vary considerably. It must have been confusing for young painters to find their own niche in this extremely varied and constantly changing market. How to position oneself in relation to others by way of subject matter, manner of paintings, and organization of the workshop. How to find customers and how to assess one's prices. Nothing was fixed anymore, except for the prices of materials. Traditional standards of assessment had evaporated. Before, until the late 16th century, a small group of painters and patrons, mainly concerned with religions commissions, shared collective standards and agreed about payments based on size, labor time, and technical and artistic accomplishments in comparison to similar paintings. But in the course of the 16th century, a few painters who had been in Italy, like Jan van Schoorl and Maarten van Heemskerk, achieved a new kind of reputation, which translated in significantly higher prices. But in the radically changing art market of the 17th century, a highly varied and rapidly growing public, buying all kinds of paintings, and I'm talking about landscapes and still lifes and so on and so forth, a public that ranged from wealthy art lovers and collectors to people of truly modest means, that made this situation change completely. From that time until the present day, the assessment of prices became for the painter a practice of trial and error, because it depended on one's reputation as an artist. But how do you decide on the level of your reputation? Since the beginning of the 17th century, the nature of the artist's reputation and the degree of fame he could aspire to had changed drastically. Though through the publications of Karel van Mander's lives, which extensive biographies of Netherlandish painters, but also through the earlier print series of artist portraits published in 1572, followed shortly after Van Mander's monumental book by another, much more extensive series of portrait prints of artists published in 1610. Through all this, the painter's profession had been effectively buttressed with a respectable history. A history in which his predecessors had become illustrious old masters. And this included a promise that each painter himself might attain a similar status. Also, in the prestigious books with city descriptions, renowned painters were recorded as components of that city's pride, and it's then in the 17th century. And they were the only professional group, apart from learned men, recorded in such prestigious books. Thus, a powerful process of canon formation had begun in the Netherlands, a canon in which one could obtain a place oneself, sometimes even during one's lifetime, as happened to the still rather young Rembrandt, Jan Lievens, Jan van Gooyen, and the very young Gerrit Douw in the description of the city of Leiden in 1641. And this must have boosted the self-esteem of such artists enormously. In this market, in which most painters did not work on commission, but on spec, so to say, reputation became particularly decisive. Rembrandt's pupil Samuel van Hoogstraten emphasized the importance of reputation and the advertising needed to acquire this. And I quote, "He, the painter, has to seek his good fortune in the first place by way of his own merit, that is, the virtue and pleasantness of his work. But without the assistance of well-disposed connections and supporters, who will do some loud advertising, die hem luidruchtig opschreeuwen, literally who loudly shout him up, he will hardly achieve any fame." Some artists never acquired the reputation they deserve, Van Hoogstraten adds grumblingly, while others managed to be much advertised by supporters without having any merit, he says also. So the role of art lovers and connoisseurs had become critical. And this group of art lovers and connoisseurs became ever larger and more knowledgeable. Some painters, like Rembrandt first among them, managed to obtain celebrity status and were able to receive high sums from a wealthy audience. They could bargain for prices higher than 100 guilders, sometimes even higher than 1,000 guilders for a painting. And to remind you that a skilled craftsman had an average yearly income of about 500 guilders a year. Many other painters, on the other hand, had to be satisfied with sums of around 10 to 50 guilders, while a great number had to be satisfied with sums of less than 10 guilders, even 1 or 2 guilders, like such a painting. And in no other genre was there such a wide range as in history painting, as you see here. There we also find the cheapest production, mostly of biblical subjects. And one would think that these were made for people only with modest means, but we also find these cheap paintings in large numbers in houses of those who have quite respectable collections, seemingly as a kind of filling up between the more expensive paintings. When Rembrandt started to work in Amsterdam, his reputation was undoubtedly already advertised, shouted up by a select group of connoisseurs, often Leiden humanists and their friends, who had spotted him immediately as a great talent, among them Constantijn Huygens, who praised him profusely as a man who had surpassed everything that had been created in antiquity and in Italy. And at the end of his Leiden period, works by Rembrandt had already been acquired by the court in The Hague, which would have strengthened both his prestige and his own level of ambition. When in Amsterdam, Rembrandt on the one hand makes use of the possibilities of an art market where painting had become a rather inexpensive commodity by selling from his workshops tronies, both by his own hand and for a lower price by pupils and collaborators, as well as copies by pupils. which were all comparatively inexpensive products that made his, and such products made his characteristic style well known among a wide audience. But at the same time, he tried from the beginning to position himself outside this market by striving to receive exceptional sums for exclusive paintings. To that end, Rembrandt would first have endeavored to further raise his reputation above that of his peers. A process of ranking was certainly taking place. His pupil van Hoogstraten wrote later in his treatise, "A good painter pursues the kind of art that is held in esteem in the place where he works, and he is also stimulated by competition in the art." And that is exactly what Rembrandt did. He focused on the demand for portraiture and history paintings, which was the kind of art that was held in esteem in the place where he works in Amsterdam, and the competition in Amsterdam, and thus the necessity to come up with something new and recognizably his own to attract the attention of connoisseurs. This competition immediately brought to great heights, both in the art of portraiture, which was a new specialism for him, as in history painting. It's not possible here to examine the nature of Rembrandt's astounding innovations, but it's clear that in this period he is in an intense and for connoisseurs recognizable dialogue with locally as well as internationally renowned artists, presenting himself consciously as the master of the passion of the souls. And that's how his pupil Samuel van Hoogstraten would call him, the master of the passion of the souls. And he was seeking to surpass others in a style that was determined by an uncompromising from life ideology, as I would call it, and a novel manner of painting and a novel manner of expressing the passions. That his style was indeed perceived as a novelty is underlined by Arnold Houbraken, a well-informed pupil of Rembrandt. A well-informed pupil of Rembrandt's pupil van Hoogstraten, sorry. So he was sort of grandson. And he writes, "The art of Rembrandt was widely admired as something new in that day, so that practitioners of the art were forced, if they wanted their work to be accepted, to adopt that manner of painting." So in a short time, his style had become the great fashion. And it's as if Houbraken is describing a present-day star when he writes, "His art was so much admired and sought after in its day that one had to beg him and throw in money to boot." But how did one decide on a monetary value of one's work? Time is money. And to calculate prices according to time spent, a very craftsmanlike method, was still the most current way to do this. We know, for example, that the artist who was, apart from Rembrandt, the most celebrated painter of his time, his first pupil, Gerrit Douw, calculated his high prices on the basis of the number of hours spent on a painting. And it's likely that almost all Dutch painters did so, in hours or days, on the basis of a fixed sum. And this fixed amount per day depended on the reputation on their reputation and could vary from 1 or 2 guilders a day to 30 guilders a day. From a rare notebook, we know that the extremely successful Adriaan van der Werf, who sold his paintings to the high and mighty of Europe, that he still worked in this way in the late 70s and early 18th century. He recorded, as you see here, with great precision with marks the days, and then calculated the price, multiplying the number of marks with 30 guilders a day. So that's the highest you can get. From the meticulously painted panels by Gerrit Douw on the one hand, or the rapidly and loosely painted works by Jan van Goyen on the other hand, one could, as it were, read off the time spent on a painting and consequently the price attached to it. The one took many weeks to paint and the other only 2 or 3 days. and the prices differed accordingly. By Douw 600 to 1,000 guilders, by Van Gooyen 30 to 60 guilders. Though Van Gooyen was not an international celebrity like Douw, he was highly appreciated for his virtuosity by connoisseurs, and I infer that he calculated a substantial 10 to 15 guilders a day. But his many followers, his many followers working in his manner would have worked for 2 or 3 guilders a day, and he had a lot of followers. So they delivered the same type of paintings as Van Gooyen for a much lower price. Not 30 to 60 guilders as Van Gooyen did, but about 6 to 10 guilders. But such a craftsman-like method was emphatically not employed by Rembrandt. Like many ambitious Italian painters, he would have considered this degrading. Even if, as a Dutch painter, you had never come into contact with the practices of Italian stars like Guido Reni, you could read in Van Mander's biographies of illustrious predecessors, such as Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian, who received fabulous sums from highly placed people as honorary payments, as honoraria, that were totally unrelated to the time spent on execution. And you could read also that such painters were insulted if the financial recompense was, in their opinion, too low. This they saw as damaging their honor and reputation. Such prices were not discussed beforehand, but it was left to the highly placed connoisseur or to determine what he was willing to pay for it. And in this way, the financial recompense was in the first place an acknowledgement of the status of the great artist and great art, and not a price for a commodity. And we recognize the same attitude in Rembrandt's letters to Huygens when he delivered the paintings of the Passion series made for stadtholder Frederick Henry. With the remuneration by a prince in particular, Rembrandt would have considered this sum as a determinant for his honor and reputation, and thus for the top level of his prices. And he responded as someone deeply injured when he was paid less than he expected. For the painting that Rembrandt delivered, no prices had been settled beforehand. After the delivery of the third painting, The Ascension of Christ of 1636, Rembrandt wrote to Huygens, the stadtholder's secretary, and I quote, "Thus I certainly deserve £200, 1,200 guilders for this painting, but I will be satisfied with what His Excellency will pay me." So he has to decide. Rembrandt mentions a ridiculously high sum he thinks the painting is worth, but leaves the decision about the value to his patron. He has no success with this strategy and receives only half of the amount, 600 guilders, which is still a huge sum. When he informs Huygens in 1638 that the last 2 paintings are finished, he does not mention a price at first. Apparently, this was not yet discussed. Only after sending them, he writes, "I think that they will be considered of such quality that His Highness will now even pay me no less than 1,000 guilders each." Finally, when it appears that he will not receive more than for the previous painting, 600 guilders, Rembrandt responds with a self-assured but quite insulting words, "If His Highness cannot in all decency be moved to a higher price, although the paintings obviously are worth it, I have to be satisfied with 600 Carolus guilders each." Though this sounds quite impudent, 7 years later he nonetheless receives 1,200 guilders each for 2 paintings which he added to the series in 1646. The Adoration of the Shepherds, which is now in a very bad condition, and the Lost Circumcision, which is only known from a workshop copy of that time. The extravagance of these sums, even within the inflated price level the court used to pay, can be demonstrated by comparing them with the sum paid a few years later for paintings delivered for the Oranjezaal, the Hall of Orange. The paintings for the triumphs were 4 times as high and 3 times as wide as Rembrandt's painting, and with many larger than life-size figures, made by painters who were characterized by Willem Frederik van Nassau as the 7 or 8 best painters of the country. They received for these triumphs 500 guilders per piece. This was certainly a large sum, but it was not to be compared to the 1,200 guilders that Rembrandt received 2 years earlier for the paintings of only 1/12 of the size. Now, it has often been said that this courtly elite did not like and understand Rembrandt's work and favored a kind of classicist Baroque style, but that is misleading. His manner of painting was highly appreciated and bought for high prices for the prince's collection, his art gallery. But these people also saw that Rembrandt's manner was not suitable for this decorative ensemble glorifying the prince. Oh, no, sorry. Glorifying the prince. And they were right. For that, you needed another type of artist, working in a different style. Because of this attitude towards the value of his art, Rembrandt would time and again run into trouble, and Paul Crenshaw wrote beautifully about this. A well-known example being the difference of opinions about payment with a Sicilian nobleman. I will not go into this. And in fact, the discussion was about a much higher sum than the best paid painters in Italy would dare to negotiate. But Rembrandt wrote shamelessly to this Ruffo, this nobleman, that apparently there were no connoisseurs in Messina, meaning people able to value his art. It appears that Rembrandt's attitude is similar to that of Italian masters like Salvator Rosa, who wrote in a comparable case that he would rather die of hunger than throw away his reputation by settling on a lower sum. So these were painters with an exceptional sense of self-esteem as artists and uncommonly assertive about the financial value of their name and reputation. Even late in his life, Rembrandt behaves in this manner again, in spite of all his financial problems, as appears from the fascinating documents about the extraordinary commission of a Genovese nobleman to make 2 modelli for altarpieces. The altarpieces were never made, the modelli have been lost. Rembrandt promised to do this, to paint these modelli, in 1 month. But only after 8 months, the Italian agents being driven to total despair by this, and they write literally, this difficult and unpredictable man, the agent finally got hold of these modelli. No price had been agreed upon beforehand, but Rembrandt received the outrageous sum of 1,023 guilders for these 2 modelli. And at a certain point during the negotiations, the agents wrote despairingly that he even wanted 3,000 guilders. And he said he maintains that he is someone who has knowledge of the art of painting and therefore stands his ground. So the pattern is clear. Only the honor and fame of his art counts, and only he himself, the great master, knows the value of his work. Very few paid prices are known, but from appraisals of probate inventories, we do know quite a few valuations of his works during his lifetime. In 1657, inventory of Johannes de Reminialme, an art dealer who catered for the top of the art market and who had 12 paintings recorded as Rembrandts in stock, we find the Christ and the woman taken in adultery, now in the National Gallery, valued at no less than 1,500 guilders. And remember again that the yearly income of a skilled craftsman, like a furniture maker, was about 500 guilders a year. But the estimates of the 12 Rembrandts in this inventory of the Reminialme ranges from 1,500 to 600 to 400, 350 and so on, to only 30 guilders for a painting of Joseph and Mary. So this must have been a workshop product, but still under the name of Rembrandt, which we often find with similarly low valuations in Amsterdam inventories. So, though they all carried the name Rembrandt, all these paintings, as a kind of brand name, we would now call it, a sharp distinction in quality was expressed through those estimates, which were made by very knowledgeable appraisers from 1500 through 30. This also means that clients buying such works needed a well-trained connoisseur's eye to distinguish quality, if they did not want to pay too much. Now we may wonder why the woman taken in adultery was valued at such a high amount. Joachim von Sandrart, the German painter who was in Amsterdam when Rembrandt made this painting, wrote with admiration about Rembrandt's manner of painting. His words offer us the opportunity to look at this painting in 17th century terms of appreciation. He writes that Rembrandt, and I quote, was only bent on maintaining overall harmony, and that, quote, he managed with great ingenuity and skill to break the colors in conformity with their own character, and knew how, with the help of this, to portray the true properties of lifelike simplicity and nature, the true properties and lifelike simplicity of nature, with the harmony of life itself. And also, quote, our artist showed little light and highlighted only what he considered the most important part, around which he artfully bound together light and shadow, including well-measured reflected lights, so that the light in the shadow faded away with great judiciousness, the coloring being truly glowing, all done with great insight. And when explaining the concept of houding, which denote the subtle gradations in color and tone in order to create the illusion of space, of 3 dimensions, he writes, one should observe the diminution, the reduction of tone, so that things fade away correctly and the coloring follows unhindered according to the rules of creating depth in a clear way from one figure to the other, all of them assuming their proper place with what is called in Dutch houding. Here's the word houding. In this, we can learn in particular from the industrious and in this respect extremely intelligent Rembrandt, who performed miracles, as it were, and constantly observed true harmony according to the rules of light. Shortly before Rembrandt made his work, the same Joachim von Sandrart, who might have been considered his main competitor at that moment, painted this chimney piece for the prestige and reception room of Burgomaster Johan Huidekoper, who had built a new house, and this was all finished in 1641. In that year, von Sandrart was paid 280 guilders for this painting. With this sum, we are at a different price level, even though it concerns a painter who was much better positioned socially. Trained internationally in Utrecht, London and Rome, and from a well-to-do family, Sandrart felt himself far above Rembrandt, and he underlines this social distance in his biography of Rembrandt, which he wrote much later. During his 8 years in Amsterdam, Sandrart managed to acquire among the ruling elite of Amsterdam, as well as the intellectual elite of Amsterdam, much better contacts than Rembrandt ever did. From the his history paintings of this period that we know by his hand, it appears that he did the utmost to be as different as possible from Rembrandt. In Rome, he had worked in the style of his Utrecht master Gerard van Honthorst, who had, like Sandrart after him, been quite successful in Rome in the service of Vincenzo Giustiniani. They both were in the service of Giustiniani. So Sandrart would have painted here in a style that was possibly, in Rome, expected of him. But in Amsterdam, Sandrart showed off his up-to-date knowledge and experience of the art in Rome. In such a painting, we find a mix of elements of the young Poussin, Domenichino, Pietro da Cortona, and even the sculptor Duquesnoy. All of them artists who had become personal friends of Sandrart when he was in Rome, at least that's what he writes. Nonetheless, the value of his work seems to be assessed at no more than half at Rembrandt's price level. Based on his intimate knowledge of Rembrandt's art and views that he had acquired in the late 1630s and 1640s, Sandert was able to describe Rembrandt's capacities in an unusually perceptive and admiring way. But the highly contrasting type of art that Sandert himself introduced in Amsterdam was undoubtedly better geared towards a new type of painting meant to be fitted into the paneling of monumental chimneys in prestigious reception rooms of the Amsterdam elite. As of the mid-1640s, Rembrandt's former pupils, Govert Flinck and Ferdinand Bol, would follow up on this with different means. But Rembrandt's art, made for the art collections of wealthy connoisseurs, for their art collections, would remain much higher value than of any other history painter in Amsterdam. Like Sandert before them, and in contrast to Rembrandt, Flinck and Bol would mainly work on commission within a carefully built network of the Amsterdam ruling elite. And thus they applied themselves to works with a different function, for which also a different style was needed. Well, I have to pass over the talented and successful artists as Bol and Flinck, as well as the many moderately successful painters, to be able to give some insight in a much cheaper production of paintings. And as an example, I first take someone who did rather well, but whose name will not mean anything to you, not even to specialists, and that is David Collijns. His first dated work is of the year 1626. It's a commission, and we know the price he was paid for it. It's a large painting of 2 meters wide, with Pharaoh with the army drowning in the Red Sea, made for the consistory of the old church, where it still hangs. He was paid 37 guilders. This comes as a shock after the preceding prices. Apparently, the church council had no need for a masterpiece, but only for a subject to be depicted recognizably. A subject that was highly meaningful for the Calvinists from the southern Netherlands, from families of former refugees, to whom many members of the church council belonged, and also the artist himself, in fact. Collijns' style recalls the Antwerp master Frans Franken the Younger, and would always retain this, to our eyes, very old-fashioned Flemish character. Most of his known works are from the 1630s and 1640s. He also worked as a furniture painter, and we know that he made copies after he had copies made after other masters in his studio by collaborators. And after 1629, he was head of the St. Luke Guild several times, so he was a well-respected man. Collijns must have had considerable production, as we find his works quite often in inventories, and many of those paintings listed in inventories include estimates, which gives a fairly reliable impression of the relative value of his work during his lifetime. They are on average around 30 guilders. He appears to be a jack of all trades, able to cater to every wish, be it organ shutters or familiar biblical subjects, favorites from classical mythology or classical history. By borrowing skillfully from 16th century prints, he is always able to produce acceptable compositions. It's remarkable that his paintings are often quite large in size, many of them more than 1 meter to 1.5 meter wide, and seems to be of the size of a chimney piece. They appear to be made for people who wanted to have a substantial painting on their mantle or wall, but did not want to spend a lot of money. In inventories, we find his work, his paintings often that they belong to the most expensive paintings in such an inventory, while the rest consists of mostly very cheap anonymous paintings. Thus they were owned, it seems, by people who paid more for a work by Collijns than they usually paid for other paintings. However, it's also not that simple. We also find Colijns's work in quite a number of respectable collections, where they belong to the inexpensive category. Therefore, it's very hard to generalize and say that these paintings were only for quite unsophisticated people. Now, and it would now be convenient to say that such painters worked in a conservative style and that they worked for different social sections of the Amsterdam public, but confusingly, we find them in all kinds of collections. And sometimes such painters do try to develop something new, like Rombout van Trooijen. Van Trooijen's paintings were valued in inventories at even less than half of Colijn's, between 5 and 15 guilders, depending on the size. But he developed a very recognizable and in some respects quite innovative style. He must have had a huge production of rather creepy scenes in mysterious, huge caverns with dripping vegetation and bizarre glittering altars and idols. These are thinly and quickly painted with small, wildly gesturing figures, rapidly modeled with tiny daubs of light paint against a dark background. Scenes of sacrifice were his specialty, such as Salomo's idolatry, but he looked around for all kinds of sacrifices, such as the obscure subject of King Acaz sacrificing his son, or simply pagan sacrifices without a special source. And sometimes sensational spectacles, including sacrifices in the open, such as Jehu killing the priest of Baal, or burning Troy with Achilles rising from his grave to demand the sacrifice of Polyxena. And these recall the scenes of horror so popular in the Amsterdam theater. Though we see a constant recycling of certain figures and postures, Van Trooijen never repeats the compositions exactly, which means that he invested time and again in pictures by painting the same subject, but a bit differently. We find his paintings mainly in inventories of modest estates, and especially concentrated in a neighborhood where he lived himself, which probably means that he paints his depth with paintings, which was a quite usual thing to do. But it's difficult to generalize again, but because we do find his works also in quite respectable collections. Many steps lower still, there are artists like Leendert de Laaf and Barend Slort. We find their names only in a few inventories of art dealers operating at the lower end of the art market. They must have churned out huge numbers of paintings for those dealers. In the inventory of the dealer Cornelis Doek, 63 works by Leendert de Laaf are listed. And the dealer Hendrik Meijering had 70 works by Barend Slort in stock. And only one signed painting is known now from this bad reproduction. That's the only Slort we still know. But there must have been hundreds. Such works were valued at only 1 to 4 guilders. And great research has been published on this very interesting mass production by Angela Jager recently. When studying the relation between artists, subject matter, style, customers, market strategy, and economic value, there is much that remains hard to explain, because such an important role was played by imponderables like reputation, talent, and quality, and concepts like fashions and trends. They are easy to, such terms and concepts are easily used, but impossible to apply with precision. But during the last decades, our insights have certainly increased substantially, starting in the early 80s with the highly important and stimulating work of the American Yale economist John Michael Montius. And since then, many younger scholars, economic historians, and art historians have contributed significantly. Especially through new archival research, much progress has been made in this field. I myself have often focused on exploring matters of artistic rivalry and competition among artists, and that is what I will talk about in the next 2 lectures. Thank you.
So thank you again for a wonderful lecture, Professor Sluyter. And I want to remind you to come back next Friday at 4 o'clock for part 2 in our Erasmus lecture series. Thank you.
Oh,